opening up diagonals for the queen and bishop, aiming for central influence and rapid development. Opens a vital diagonal for the queen and bishop, immediately contesting central space. Gambiting a pawn immediately opens the f-file and potentially exposes your king, a bold but risky path inviting sharp counterplay. Embracing the gambit, black opens the king's file and dares white to exploit their exposed monarch. Developing the bishop openly eyes the unprotected f7 pawn, immediately posing a tactical threat. Challenging white's central pawns, black immediately fights for space and opens lines for active piece play. Liberating the d-file opens diagonals, forcing black to defend awkwardly while white consolidates. King's safety is immediately compromised by this aggressive queen sortie, inviting tactical complications and potential material loss. Shielding the king's vital escape square with a desperate retreat, this action concedes central control and invites further pressure. Pushing pawns to expose the king's path creates significant king safety issues, even if it gains tempo. Developing the knight to f3 not only gets a piece into the game, but also crucially defends the e5 pawn from potential future attacks, offering a vital point of stability amidst this chaotic opening. Shifting the queen to the wing, black aims to sidestep the immediate check and potentially exploit the open kingside. But this maneuver leaves the king rather exposed, forfeiting valuable tempo that could be used for development. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm creates immediate chaos, but strategically exposes your own monarch to the encroaching enemy queen and bishop, demanding sharp defensive maneuvering. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the kingside pawn structure and prepares to castle, a crucial step towards king safety. Developing this knight aggressively addresses the immediate threat of the black queen and prepares to contest the center, a crucial but previously neglected battleground. White's king, already exposed, now finds some slight respite as the piece itself gains a square. Challenging the center directly with c6 aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines, though it risks weakening the queenside pawn structure. Challenging black's central pawn push and redeploying the bishop to a more active diagonal, this move aims to pressure the queen and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure, though it does invite further complications on the queenside. Unleashing a knightly pin, black immediately challenges the bishop's awkward diagonal placement, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially open lines towards the compromised king. Unlocking the central tension, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's queen's active placement and potentially open lines for white's pieces. It's a dynamic decision that injects complexity, forcing black to consider how to consolidate their queen and defend against burgeoning threats. The central control is paramount, and this move signals white's intention to contest it fiercely. Developing the knight to d7 establishes a flexible defensive structure, reinforcing e5 and preparing for potential pawn advances or piece activity, while also avoiding immediate tactical engagement with the aggressive kingside play. Relocating the king to f2 strategically aims to reinforce the e3 square, offering a potential escape route from the rampant qh4. It also sets up a defensive screen, though it does leave the monarch somewhat exposed on the diagonal. Unleashing a tactical storm, black sacrifices a bishop to disrupt white's pawn structure and expose the monarch, aiming to exploit the open lines for swift material gain or even a mating attack. Opening the g-file, white dramatically alters the central pawn structure, immediately placing immense pressure on black's vulnerable king and potentially activating the rook for a powerful assault. Embracing the queenside castle introduces immediate dynamism, but it also stretches black's king far from its pawn shield, creating a long-term defensive burden amidst white's impending central pawn thrust. Unleashing the h-file opens a direct avenue for assault, aiming to dismantle black's pawn shield and expose their king, currently tucked away on the queenside, which creates an interesting spatial imbalance. Unleashing the queen into this skirmish immediately after white's pawn thrust exposes it to potential harassment, but it also re-establishes a menacing presence on the kingside diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's tentative development and exploit the open G-file that white just created. A curious repositioning of the knight, aiming to potentially shore up the kingside or seek active squares, though it relinquishes central influence and allows black's queen an uncontested avenue to menace white's exposed monarch. Black's queen, having enjoyed a brief promenade, now retreats to a more stable square, aiming to connect the rooks and support central pawn breaks. This repositioning, while seemingly passive, sets the stage for potential counterplay on the queen side, possibly involving a nf6 followed by c5 pawn thrust. Notice how black's pieces are beginning to harmonize, a stark contrast to white's somewhat disjointed structure after the pawn sacrifice and king's early march. The open G-file, while dangerous, also provides black's king with a degree of safety by offering escape squares. Consolidating the pawn chain on the king side, c3 anchors the central structure, preparing to possibly advance the d-pawn or reinforce the knight outpost, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the queen to potentially rejoin the fray or support a queenside expansion. Unleashing the knight toward the center, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create tactical complications around the king, leveraging the open lines that have emerged. Suddenly, the queen finds herself under siege, aiming to control key squares and disrupt black's developing coordination. Black seeks to simplify the position by exchanging pieces, aiming to neutralize white's initiative and exploit the exposed king. The exchange on c4 disrupts white's pawn structure and opens up the queen side, potentially creating tactical opportunities for black's remaining pieces. This move also removes a key defender from white's central squares, potentially weakening the coordination of white's pieces. Black's decision here suggests a belief that the resulting endgame will favor them, perhaps due to white's king's compromised position and the potential for black's knights to become active. There's a subtle positional sacrifice occurring. By giving up the knight, black aims for long-term strategic advantages rather than immediate material gain. Unleashing the queen's power onto the d-file, this capture decisively reclaims material and opens a critical line for white's pieces, creating immediate pressure and forcing black to react to the newfound queenly threat. The knight's embarkation to f6 aims to fortify the kingside's defenses, but it simultaneously creates a potential congestion point for black's own pieces. Think about the long-term ramifications. Will this knight prove to be a valuable defender, or will it become a passive bystander, hindering the development and coordination of your other pieces on the queen side? Consider how the open G-file might still be exploited by white's rook. The bishop's return to f4 immediately reasserts control over the open e-file, a critical artery now that the pawn structure is fractured. It also sets up a potential threat on the g5 pawn, a target that black might have overlooked in their aggressive setup. Now the knight's repositioning, escaping the bishop's pin and seeking a more active square, subtly sets the stage for potential future pawn pushes or defensive maneuvers along the central files. Shifting the queen to the queen side, white aims to contest the open files and potentially coordinate an attack on black's still somewhat exposed king. Introducing a pawn to the queenside aims to gain a foothold and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. A modest but reasonable attempt to introduce some dynamic possibilities into what's becoming a somewhat static position. The queen's repositioning to a5 aims to exploit the slightly passive placement of black's knight on d7 and the open h-file, creating potential pressure points and restricting black's maneuvering options. Repositioning the knight to f8 unlocks the potential for a kingside advance, aiming to reinforce g6 and threaten an eventual ng6 for disruption, while simultaneously preparing to contest the critical d7 square, a crucial pivot point in this complex structure. The knight finds a more centralized post, preparing to potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or simply enhance its influence over the central squares. The knight's foray to e6 opens a dynamic new front, directly challenging white's queenside structure and aiming to disrupt the pawn chain that currently anchors black's position. This bold maneuver, while potentially exposing the king slightly, promises active piece play and seeks to exploit the current disorganization of white's forces, especially the awkwardly placed dark-squared bishop on c4. The knight's new centralizing influence could also pave the way for future pawn advances, or facilitate the redeployment of other pieces into attacking formations. Unleashing the knight to h5 is a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open new attacking avenues, particularly targeting the kingside. This aggressive posture, while potentially creating imbalances, forces black to remain vigilant against immediate threats and consider counterplay carefully. The knight's repositioning also sets up future tactics, potentially forking pieces or creating mating nets, but it does withdraw from direct defensive duties on the kingside, a calculated risk. The immediate threat to the knight on f6 is parried, but this retreat conserves black's bishop pair, potentially a significant advantage if the position opens further, while also keeping the queen centrally positioned to influence both wings. A crucial moment for establishing central dominance, bg3 subtly aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around black's kingside, especially with the f-pawn no longer a defense. This repositioning prepares for a more dynamic game, potentially supporting a knight leap to the f5 square or reinforcing the center if black attempts further pawn pushes. Consider how this bishop's new perch might influence the open kingside, creating new attacking avenues and forcing black to remain vigilant about potential tactics. The move also signifies white's intention to consolidate their position after some earlier tactical skirmishes, aiming for a more harmonious piece placement. Look for how this bishop's influence might restrict black's piece mobility, particularly the dark-squared bishop, which now finds its scope somewhat limited. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank initiates a crucial endeavor to activate this underutilized piece and potentially contest the open d-file, while simultaneously offering an escape route for the king should the queenside become too congested. Suddenly, the knight penetrates the enemy's 7th rank, injecting a disruptive force into black's camp and directly threatening the unprotected rook on d7. The recapture offers a chance to regroup and simplify, but it also relinquishes the bishop's crucial diagonal, potentially opening avenues for white's pieces to penetrate the queenside. Watch for developing queenside play. A bold assertion of central control. This queen maneuver aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain, while simultaneously creating immediate threats to the unprotected knight. Initiating a fundamental exchange, black dissolves the tension by recapturing the queen with their own, fundamentally altering the material balance and paving the path towards a more simplified middle game or potential endgame. Re-establishing the pawn chain after the queen exchange, this recapture simultaneously clears the d-file for your rooks and prepares to exert pressure on black's somewhat exposed king. Opening up the f-file offers a tantalizing, yet perilous, pathway for the black rook, hinting at a potential re-engagement on the kingside where white's monarch remains conspicuously exposed. Striking at the rook with tempo, white forces a decision while simultaneously reinforcing the knight on f3 and preparing to activate the queen on the kingside. Repositioning the rook to the open file aims to challenge white's control and potentially create counterplay, acknowledging the pawn sacrifice that opened this diagonal. Opening the h-file with the rook immediately targets black's castled king, aiming to exploit the vulnerable pawn shield that black has allowed to form. Reactivating the knight to f4 offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to disrupt white's dominant piece placement and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. Relocating the king to a more central position aims to participate in the endgame and possibly support pawn advances, a bold choice given the lingering threats on the kingside. A dazzling shot that pierces white's king's defenses. This knight's daring advance, foregoing immediate material gain, creates a potent fork, threatening both the king and the rook on d7. The white king, already exposed by the pawn structure and the capture on f6, now faces immediate danger, potentially leading to significant material loss or a king hunt that could cripple white's position. Your king is now facing a significant threat as the knight delivers a dangerous check. Prioritizing safety becomes paramount, and repositioning towards the corner offers some refuge from the immediate onslaught, though the rook now stands exposed on the 7th rank. The rook's journey to the 7th rank aims to activate a dormant piece and create pressure along the open file, potentially tying down the opposing king or creating mating threats if white isn't careful. Pushing the e-pawn forward now opens a dynamic diagonal for the queen and aims to destabilize black's pawn chain, creating potential targets on the king side should black decide to solidify. The knight's journey to f4 seeks to exploit the open g-file, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure around the king and potentially create tactical opportunities. A significant development is unfolding as white finally anchors their major piece to the h-file, aiming to exert pressure down the opened path and potentially exploit the exposed black king. The rook now occupies the crucial g-file, putting immediate pressure on white's kingside and demanding a response to prevent further infiltration. The battle for central territory intensifies as white plants a pawn firmly on c4, aiming to solidify its control and potentially launch a queenside expansion. A bold maneuver, e6, aiming to establish a knight outpost amidst the chaos and contest white's potentially overwhelming central pawn majority. This knight, though currently somewhat exposed, might prove a crucial defensive cog or a springboard for counterplay if white isn't careful with their king's safety in the long run. Recentering the monarch offers white a chance to regroup on the king side, away from the immediate threats lurking on the d-file and the open files, while also preparing for a potential regrouping of pieces. A bold regrouping, the knight pivots back, seeking refuge and potential counterplay on the king side, a subtle shift away from white's centralized pawn push. Opening the d-file now allows white's pieces to directly infiltrate black's position, potentially targeting the weakened king side further and creating immediate tactical threats. The king's exposure becomes a stark vulnerability, as the rooks now have a clear avenue to infiltrate the queen side, potentially pinning the knight and unraveling the defensive structure. Unleashing the pawn thrust, e6, forces the black queen and bishop into a tight squeeze, potentially disrupting their defensive harmony and creating immediate threats against the weakened king side.